Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm very excited to be here with Carla Groom, who has been on here before. And Carla works for the UK government, and she's been trying to integrate cutting-edge cognitive science into her work. She acts as, your name keeps changing, but I won't say the official name, but basically she's kind of a liaison, a hub, trying to bridge between many different departments in the UK civil service. And so she's working with both individual and distributed cognition in the trenches in something affecting a lot of lives, and trying to bring the best cognitive science to bear on that very important problem. Carla, do you think that's at least a good introduction to you and your work?
That is a lovely summary. I really like that. And yes, the name is a bit of a mouthful. We're now, when I did the previous podcast with you, it was behavioral science, and now it is human-centered design science, to try and distinguish it from the kind of a nudge approach, because we're so different that was leading to confusion. But we're still very much have a behavioral science, cognitive science anchor to what we're trying to do.
Right. Yeah. And so you've been wrestling, we were talking just before camera, with, trying to get what people are bringing to various problem solvings, various attempts at communication. And at first you were framing this around a very traditional notion of assumptions, which are sort of typically understood as underlying propositions that people are committed to, perhaps without awareness or at least full awareness of the implications. And you're now considering that perhaps you need to move to something like mental models. Now that term has a lot of different meanings within cognitive science, so we could explore those meanings. But perhaps first, set the context a little bit more. Tell us a little bit more about how that came about and why do you want to explore this, etc.
Sure. So I think the first time I used that term in a sort of public environment was when I gave a talk at the Consilience conference back in the spring. And I did a panel with Max Borders, Jim Rutt and Jordan Hall, talking about visions of governance. And one of the things that was sort of an emerging insight that I had from my 8 years of working to help the department to make better decisions, and thinking about the barriers to making better decisions, was that we seem to run up against mental models that aren't the most useful or perhaps accurate representations of reality on which policymaking and process design decisions are based. So when in the sort of things that come to mind there are mechanistic models of people, and the idea that what you're after is repeatable actions by interchangeable human beings rather than organic people bringing their full selves and solving problems that then you don't need to solve again. So the whole way that we think about the individuals in the organisation felt quite mechanistic. We've also got economic theory has filled quite a lot of the need for a mental model about policy making itself. And that has got us a long way. It's got us doing cost-benefit analysis and doing some things a lot more for an empirical rigour than might have been done before. However, there are limitations to those models, which of course has been a lot of the oomph behind the whole behavioural science movement has been that model of humans isn't very good. And so my team was set up to say, can we improve the decisions that department makes based on assumptions about people that aren't true? And we started in that, how do you unpack how do you work out when a decision has assumptions that people buried in it? How do you surface that, test it, and maybe replace it with another one? But what I think is underneath the assumption, those propositional things, is something more participatory, or at least perspectival, that is about the way the world works, that is mechanistic in metaphor, that is economic or Taylorist management in theory, and is very ahistorical. So the way that we talk in the organisation doesn't tend to reference the past or really the future. It's kind of what's wrong with the machine now, the machine of the world, and what can we do to fix it, and what levers can we pull, and all this sort of language. So my team has been thinking, how do we name this thing that seems to be enabling this huge number of humans to cooperate and produce these policies, but in a way that allows us to look at those things and upgrade it so that it leads to better organizational outcomes. So that leads to a whole bunch of questions about, is mental model the right term? Are they things that you can put down and put back on like a lens or a perspective, or is it something that once you've seen something, can't unsee it? We've been having rows in the team, very productive rows, about whether if we talk about mental models, are we breaking our own rule, which is we want policymakers to think about people without the fundamental attribution error. So we want them to be thinking about the external factors. But if we're saying that mental models are the block, are we encouraging an individualistic approach? And is a mental model an individual thing, or is it a social thing that exists through the brain? So these are all things I thought, there's one person I want to talk to about this, and it's John.
Wow. First of all, let me just say again how impressed I am with you. The acumen and astuteness of your theoretical reflection on this. And, I'm praising you because I'm confident there are many civil servants who are not attempting to do this kind of reflective work on the nature, individual and distributed cognition that is going into situations of collective problem solving, collective action problems, communication. So first of all, just wow, praise, keep going, encouragement, yes. So let's start very carefully. And you made a distinction, and you even made it in terms of levels, and I think that's a useful thing to talk about. I'll start out by different things the term mental model might mean in cognitive science, because there are different uses of the term. And then we can play with how close, which one of these is closer, or do we need to innovate on all of them to get what you are trying to put your finger on? First of all, it's a little more than intuition. There's some inference involved. So it's more like a conjecture. I do think that you're right that you're trying to point to something perspectival and participatory. It seems to have elements both of people's mind sight into each other's mind, but also into a shared worldview. Like when you mentioned a mechanistic worldview, an individualistic worldview. And so there's aspects. So one meaning of mental models is the classic formulation in the 1980s by Philip Johnson-Laird, and he wrote the book literally entitled Mental Models. And he was trying to give a theory of reasoning that was an alternative to syllogistic, propositional reasoning. And he said what people were doing often when they're reasoning, I hesitate here because one of the problems with this is it never was totally formally clear what a mental model was for Philip Johnson-Laird. One of my colleagues at the time, Christopher Green, wrote in his thesis, his PhD thesis, a quite sustained critique of this. So the best thing is to put it is that Philip Johnson-Laird says we do something like a diagram, which is a mixture of a picture and propositional labels to try and create a model of a situation. And then what we do is we sort of manipulate the model. We run the model. Instead of doing syllogistic reasoning, we sort of turn that diagram into like a film, a movie, and we run it, right? And that is how we unpack what the consequences of some of our beliefs are. Now, that's the standard meaning. Now, the problem with that we might be able to fix by connecting it to some other things is, like I said, it's the notion of picture and the notion of diagram are famously vague. Wittgenstein made this argument a long time ago. If I show you a picture of a person on the side of a hill, are they walking up a hill? Are they standing on the hill? Are they walking backwards down the hill? Is that a picture of the fact that now John likes to go on hills and he didn't like to go on hills before? Is that a way of showing you that the English countryside may be more hilly than you realize? Like the number of things that it can be, and you like, and then if you try and capture a diagram, you have the fact, well, that no sentence can say everything that it's conveying, and you get all this stuff going on. So that's problematic. I think there's something to your notion that what's going on here is something imaginal. And I'll remind you of the distinction between the imaginary and the imaginal. This is another way of talking about modeling. And this is Corbin's distinction between the imaginary, whereas I form something like an internal mental picture, which is kind of like what Johnson-Laird is talking about. So I can picture a sailboat, or I can picture somebody on a hillside, etc. Versus the imaginal, where I'm not really picturing anything. I'm adopting the perspective, the salience landscape, the perspectival knowing. So it's a classic example are children at play. The child picks up a stick and ties a blanket and says, I'm Zorro. They're not picturing Zorro. They're trying to take on the perspectival knowing and the participatory knowing, the identity. What's it like to assume the identity of Zorro, and what kind of arena opens up with that identity, and what kinds of salience landscaping, and that might allow them to actually cultivate skills of government. So do you see the difference between the first sense? Okay, so there's that sort of diagrammatic sense, and then there's the imaginal sense. And then there's a third sense, which is very prevalent right now, which comes out of the predictive processing framework. And I've been working with Mark Miller, Brett Anderson, and other people, and we've integrated the relevance realization and the predictive processing framework. So we did that in a paper at the end of last year. And that is basically saying, well, and this comes also out of some of Geoffrey Hinton's primary insights behind deep learning, et cetera, the wake-sleep algorithm. And what it says is what I do, and what you're always doing is you're trying to build what's called a generative model. And the idea here is what you're trying to do is sort of, a model isn't necessarily a picture or a set of propositions. It's a way in which you are anticipating, expecting the world, you're predicting in that sense, not necessarily like stating a proposition, but you're anticipating and expecting and sort of sensory motor preparation for the world, right? And so you're trying to get, in that sense, very different sense, you're trying to model the causal structure of a world. And often what you're doing is you're generating a model ahead of time in order to try and recognize the model. You can do really cool things. I was at a talk, I was at a thing last night, and I gave a talk, and then Mark gave a talk, and you can play basically nonsensical sounds to somebody, and then you can say a sentence to them, and then when you play the exact same thing again, they'll hear the sentence and the nonsense sound. Because as soon as I say a sentence, you've built this predictive model, and then you go looking in the white noise for anything that confirms the model. So we have these three things, and they're not necessarily antagonistic, but they're not the same either. There's that sort of inner diagram, and you sort of run it, right? Then there's the imaginal thing, where you're not really forming an inner thing, you're taking on the perspective and the identity. And then the third one is you're trying to anticipate and expect how the world will unfold. And you're largely, and this is where it overlaps with the second one, you're largely in the imaginal sense, imagining how the world's going to unfold, but in that imaginal sense. And so those are three senses. The last two line up very well with perspectival and participatory. The first one, at least not explicitly so. So those are the three that are sort of on offer when people talk about mental models. And of course, there's all kinds of combinations and variations. So let's just call those, I'm not saying this is exhaustive, but those are sort of the three, prominent paradigmatic readings for mental model. Which one sort of feels closest to what you are trying to get at?
So I can definitely see elements of all three. So only if I've correctly understood what they mean, but the diagram one feels like that helps identify which parts of an almost infinitely complex landscape are worth paying attention to. So it creates a salience landscape. I don't know if I'm used that correctly.
Yes, you are. You very correctly.
So that feels like some of what is going on is that we work in an extraordinarily complex and complicated policymaking environment, and you've got to have some way of chunking things up so that you can have sensible conversations. And it's framing, right? It's chunking.
Yes, yeah.
So I think that's part of what it does. The imaginal one has that, I guess, that sense of value sort of in it as well, and a sort of personal consequence. So what am I empowered to do if I'm Zorro?
Yeah.
What am I threatened by? What do I get rewarded for? So it's got that kind of, it's got the values attached to the beliefs and the salience. And what was the third one again?
The generative model, where you're not really, what you're trying to do is you're trying to anticipate and expect the possible interactions with the world.
So this is where, because policy and process in civil service is essentially changing the world, then in order to simulate what a change would look like, or even to simulate what somebody in the hierarchy might respond to your suggested change, you need to have this is where it's quite, in some respects, different from academia, is that it's all about those sorts of consequences. Not that there aren't consequences in academia, but this is our bread and butter, is change. And so an idea of what we all agree are the things that can change and what they might lead to, or even just the ability, if you bring somebody in out of university and you say, right, can you take a look at this really complex social problem? They need some kind of framework to be knowing what sorts of things are. So the civil service is very good at socializing people into this model very fast so they can be useful very quickly, but within the constraints of those models. At least that's the thing, that's what I'm going on. So I can see elements of all of them.
That's great. And it's clear to me you have understood each one very well. So that's not an issue. There's no clarification required. And of course, like I said, it's not necessarily the case that these three are antagonistic. So it could be that you are trying to put your finger, and which is often the case. Each theory actually captures a different dimension of a very complex cognitive phenomena. So perhaps what you might want to reflect on is that each one of these is a dimension of what you're talking about. Okay, so you've got the sort of inner diagram, you've got the imaginal, and then you've got a way in which you're trying to set up an agent-arena relationship through anticipation, and and so I think that's helpful. Then there's now two broader notions that aren't theories of models per se, but sort of what models are doing, and we could bring that in. So one is one of my students, Corey Lewis, and his PhD did some excellent work in the philosophy of science, contrasting laws and models, and then theories have to do with relations. And he made a very good distinction, what I think is very apt. And it wasn't just my opinion, because his defense was successful, and he's now a cognitive scientist in his own right. Excellent one, by the way. Very proud of so many of my students.
Oh,
very proud of any of them.
Wonderful.
And so he has a notion that what laws in science do is they rule out. They say, these are things you can't bring into consideration. And what a model does is it rules in. It says, these are the things you must bring in as you try and explain. So the idea is when you're explaining, you're framing, and what you're doing is you're ruling out and ruling in. And the theory rules out, and people can get enmeshed in theory. The laws, like that was a mistake. I made a mistake. I apologize. The theory is about negotiating between both. The laws rule out, and that might be something like sort of the rules you're not allowed to break or something like that. They rule out, but the models rule in, and they say, this is what you must include. So they involve decisions about, as you were saying, what's salient, relevant, and also what is mandatory to bring into any explanation. And of course, that could be negotiable, because people might be assuming, not propositionally, but perspectively in a participatory manner, they might be assuming what is mandatory in any explanation. Now that plugs into another thing about models. And you heard me saying models, right? There's a relationship between models and laws in our theories. And then there's that relationship. But models, insofar as they are ruling in what is mandatory, they are often acting as emissaries, I'll steal one of Ian's terms, emissaries for a worldview.
Yeah.
Right? So the worldview is a worldview is at the meta meaning level. A world is basically a model of how the world is, right? And how you know the world, and it models you for the world, and it models the world for you. So it's meta meaning. It makes possible that agent-arena relationship that makes all other meaningful affordances and interactions and perspectives and arguments possible for us, right? So that's what, you invoked what? There's a mechanistic, the world is a machine, and it's an ahistorical machine. Time doesn't need to be brought in. It's not what we have to rule in with our model. So what you can also ask is, now you've got these three dimensions of what a model is. And I think you're absolutely right to plug it into the perspective of the participatory. You can then ask the question, what is the model ruling in? And then deeper, but derived from that, the deeper is, how is it acting as an emissary for a worldview, and what is that worldview?
Yeah, I'm really drawn to the worldview thing because I'm wondering if that is actually, are these nested concepts? Are they? Yeah, because it feels like some of these things are big and shared by large numbers of people, and then some of them are sort of digested down into the version of that we use in a particular policy area or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm feeling equally torn now between thinking it's the worldview level and it's the model level.
Right. So the way of putting them together, that's what I was invoking with the emissary, is the worldview is basically a meta model. It's not a model. It gives you sort of the way in which you create any models, right? And then the model takes from the worldview and creates a specific thing that has ruled in what from the worldview should be applied to this specific situation. So it's a way of specifying the worldview for a particular problem.
Yes. That is really, really interesting. So you might have a mechanistic cultural worldview, and then that translates into, for example, seeing my portion of the government as a set of repeatable deliverables that ideally don't change over time and generate the same output every time, which may or may not be appropriate for delivering effective policy.
Right.
Yeah.
And then and so your intuition also, we don't want to lose that this is just, we're working out a more detailed analysis of how framing relevance realization, anticipation of the world is unfolding. Yeah. And that's what's going on. So you have to remember that what's often happening in these is that I'll call them, it's not quite decisions, but that like framings, like there's decisions about what is relevant and decisions about what is real. And why? Because relevance and real interpenetrate. They're often confused and conflated together because this seems so relevant to this worldview, it must be real. Right? Yes. And so the other thing that you're looking at when people are doing this, right, is you're saying, well, this mechanistic worldview makes these features, for example, makes ahistorical features foregrounds, they make backgrounds, the historical features. And that's real to you because that's how you're making sense. But the thing is, right, can we do a figured ground reversal? And what happens? And and then there's ways in which you can get insight at that sort of meta modeling or even at the modeling level just by saying, maybe we're conflating or confusing what's relevant and what's real here, sliding from one into the other without question. And the thing that you need to remind people is truth, not just propositional, but all the reals, right? The four real. Truth and relevance are at a point of processing. They correct each other. Relevance makes sure we don't go after intractable, trivial, irrelevant truths, and truth means we don't project relevance models that are actually not picking up on what is relevantly real about a situation.
So what if something is the thing that has become less useful about the model is that it is no longer picking up the aspects of it that are most relevant? Does that mean it's not real, or just that it's not relevant?
So I would say that it's not. These are not sort of easy yes no because if there was no purchase on reality, then typically that would be that the model is obviously false. Although there are people that get involved with all kinds of rabbit hole conspiracy theories and things like that. But generally, it would be more like saying, to what degree are we focusing on patterns that are merely correlated with our problem versus patterns that are actually, we have good reason and evidence to believe are causal, right? Causally relevant to our pattern. And so that's a way you can sort of sort of specify, make the question more precise and more probative. It's like, okay, I don't deny that you're seeing that pattern. Is that pattern, like, can you tell me, do we have good reason to believe that that's actually the causal pattern that is at work there?
Yeah, that feels, I remember very early on in developing the sort of bones for this team, I remember being struck one day walking down the river and saying, it's about causality. That's the bit that for me was the missing piece, was we're really good at measurement, extrapolation, hypothesis testing, but that focus on causality was more second, not absent, but backgrounded. And that's one of the things that I've tried to drag out, put more into the foreground.
Excellent. So one more thing on this, which is, and this goes back to the worldview, because worldviews have like implicit ruling in it as to what kind of causes count. And mechanistic worldview says that the only kind of causation is efficient causation, what I sometimes call bumpation. One thing bumps into another. Like, really, it's a billiard ball model of causation. And we can call that horizontal because that's like how on a table that one billiard ball knocks the next. And that's the model of causation that has been made prevalent, was made prevalent in the Newtonian worldview. But more and more people, and Wolfgang Smith and myself, and a lot of other people are now talking about vertical causation, which is how does a higher order thing emerge from a lower order thing, and how does a higher order thing constrain a lower order thing? And of course, Alicia Guerrero is doing her two books, Dynamics in Action and Context Changes Everything, right? And also Wolfgang Smith. And this is more about not causation as bumpation, but how does the structural functional organization emerge bottom up and emanate top down? And you have to ask those vertical causal questions, not just the horizontal questions. And so one of the things that a mechanistic worldview tends to miss is the vertical causation, which is often the relevant causal factor that needs to be considered.
Oh gosh, I love that. I'm trying to think what that would, can constraint go both ways? So could you have, so for example, if we're making policies and one of their sort of units of analysis is that the person on the street responding to that, they actually have a bunch of constraints either built into their lives or into who they are that actually constrains what we can do in terms of policy, but it's not always obvious.
Yes.
Would that work?
Yes, that works. It's fine. And so you have to talk about sort of also two types of constraints, right? Talk about selective and enabling constraints. So enabling constraints are what are the conditions that enable a process to run, create all the variation and the viability. Selective constraints are what are the things that hold it back, so reduce the options for a system so it doesn't fly off the rails. And then, you can definitely look for constraints in both directions, and then you can also look for different kinds of constraints.
That's really helpful. So one of the things that that it feels like we're getting a language here that is helpful for talking about some of the problem. And I remember originally thinking that people reach for the term groupthink, but it's not the right. I mean, we know it's got a highly specific term, but that we couldn't come up with another one. So maybe this set of ideas around mental models is the best way of describing the process that is going on when you have people making very coordinated decisions based on a very limited set of assumptions, which will in some cases be really efficient and effective at delivering outcomes. But in other cases, especially when things are changing and those models happen, it's going to lead to increasingly ineffective decisions being made. And if that's the case, I'm wondering what are the processes by which organizations maintain those models, even when the limitations of them keep actually in practice, scuppering our goals. Because these are very, I'm just sort of thinking there's a book called The Blunders of Our Government, which documents the kinds of administrative failures that have happened regardless of the political layer since at least the 1980s. And it's the same kinds of things. And that's really part of my mission, is to try and what's that shared understanding of what has gone wrong before? And one of the things that's interesting about having done my job for 8 years is how incredibly tough those things are. And to even the extent that I tend not to hire people into my team who've been in the civil service because it's so powerful. Now, is it that we've selected people who respond to that and people who don't respond to that kind of buying into a mental model leave, or they don't come in the first place? Or is it that there's some really powerful factors that hold it so that the constraints aren't even being made by the people at the top, they're being made by this thing that comes from that.
Right. So I don't know. I mean, my work has been on the other side of that question. So, and this is work done with my good friend and colleague, co-author, Dan Chiappi, and we published papers on this. So we've been looking about how we agency, not the agency, right, and not the agency just adding us together, but how we form this thing called we agency, which is basically the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. So, and this notion goes back to Hutchins and the fact that no one person navigates a ship. It's a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of equipment, and they form a dynamical system that self-organizes, and that's a we agent. What we were studying how NASA scientists on the Earth moved the rovers around on Mars to do the science, and how they were constantly having to adjust, and about how they create shared narratives and shared mental models, and how they try to get this balance between a stable structure and the ability to adapt and make the structure flow. And what was interesting, what they're looking for in people that join the team, they're looking for people who could do this imaginal perspectival participatory thing, which is they can become the rover on Mars. They could be the rover and be on Mars in an imaginal way. And they do all these really interesting things with their photos in order to get people who could be the rover and see like a rover on Mars. You might want to take a look at those 3 papers because it really lays out the language of we agency, talks about the use of shared narrative and imaginal techniques and participatory identification techniques, and how they try to balance between a stable structure and an evolving structure. Now, there's obvious differences between what NASA's doing and you're doing, but so we were trying to study the opposite in some ways. Your question is, why don't people change? And we were trying to say, well, how do people keep it changing and adapting in a very weird, difficult situation? Because it's not joystick control because of the time lag, right? And all they were getting were flat black and white pictures. And they're trying to use this to figure out how to move the rover around and how to do the field work. And so there's 3 papers there the published papers, one in Frontiers, one in Phenomenology of the Cognitive Sciences, and one in a journal called Presence, about all of that. You can see and we also talk about perspectival and participatory knowing. It was interesting because the scientists get to this, they're literally rocket scientists, and the engineers, they get to this point where they'll do things like this. They'll say, I was working in the garden and, my right hand kept getting stuck. And then I'd gone to the lab and Spirit, funnily enough, that's the name of one of the rovers, and Spirit's right wheel kept getting stuck. I don't believe in magic or anything like that, but there's always these weird connections. And more than and they form this almost sympathetic magic. And please note, anybody, people just listening, I'm using scare quote single, right? Because the participatory and the perspectival are so privileged and prioritized, because you have to get that before you can then develop the procedural skills, so you can do the field work. And then only once you can do the field work can you actually generate the propositional theory.
I really like that. And it's just led me to think, is there so I definitely hire people who are extremely good at perspective taking as one of our criteria.
Good.
That's what I'm after. I'm after first principles thinking. Yeah. But I'm just kind of thinking what's sort of anchoring some of these models in the government. And I wonder if it is, I'm just making this up, but a sense of what our ministers need. So are we channeling, are they the robot? Are we trying to think what the world looks like to them? But
yes.
But that doesn't change very quickly.
Keep going. Yeah. Keep going. That's good. Keep going. That's excellent.
Yeah, I think because ultimately what we're trying to do is to make decisions. Well, decisions in the government have to be made by the ministers. We don't make anything other than operational decisions. But in order to make that work, you kind of need to take lots of decisions in order to create the options that then make decisions. So even though I've talked to lots of ministers in the both in my previous civil service career and then since I've been doing this, that they often have more of a diverse range of things that they would accept, that in order for us to coherently deliver a service, we are actually potentially wedded to a sense of what ministers want.
Yes.
Could be holding this together.
I think that's brilliant. So let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that, like, now basically by analogy, obviously, what the scientists were doing with the rovers, the civil servants are doing with the minister, and they're maybe even forming what Mead calls a generalized other. It might not be a model of a specific minister, but what any minister might want, and then that might be actually limiting their ability to. Yes. Oh, and that's interesting because what the scientists do is they have sort of rituals of identification. They'll talk about the robot as if it's them, like their body. We need to move our arm, or I need to move my arm like this, and they're talking about the robot. Or they'll actually turn themselves into the robot. Like one scientist, this is a rock, and she's on a wheelchair. I need to do this, and she's wheeling around on the chair. These are the cameras, and she's doing this. And they do this loop where they anthropomorphize the robot and they technomorphize themselves. That's Vertessi's terms. And how are people identifying with the minister, or how are they identifying with this generalized version of the minister is probably also something that's at work here. And trying to get out that model. That's really interesting. So what you're saying, I think this is very powerful. You're saying not only are people modeling the situation, they're not modeling it just for themselves. They're modeling it, because they're trying to they're doing mutual modeling. Mutual modeling is the idea that, so if you and I are going to work efficiently, we have to communicate a lot so we don't act at cross purposes. But if we communicate a lot, we're wasting a lot of time and a lot of effort and not solving problems, so that becomes inefficient. So the way we get around that is you form a model of me and I form a model of you. We work independently, but we consult the model, and that's how we work independently, but also in a coordinated fashion. So they're mutually modeling the minister, right? And then they're modeling that, right? They're modeling the situation in terms of how the minister would see it. Oh, yeah, I think that's very, very plausible. And so the question I would ask is, what practices do they have for not concentrating on modeling the problem, but correcting their modeling of the minister?
So we have a well-established process of taking into account ministers' preferences. So because we have reshuffle, so every so often we get a change of ministers. Sometimes it can be, depending on what's happening in politics, multiple times a year. So you have to have a system that allows policymaking to keep working whilst having changes of personnel at the top, all within a single party in charge. So that sense of a generalised other makes sense, because while we do have conversations with the new minister about, do you like charts? Do you like numbers? Do you want to get into the detail? Do you not want to get into the detail? So we know how to have those conversations and how to build trust with a minister. But I wonder if we're really creating the space for that level of question, and also whether that would be sustainable, given that the moment that you'd adjusted for the new minister, there's been another one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe there's an intermediary thing, not trying to pick up on everything, but trying to pick up on something other than the preferences. For example, try to get clearer about how the minister might model. What's their worldview? What's their meta model? And how, right? And how that, right? So not just their preferences, because it's much more like what's their worldview? How would they model problems, etc. Things like.
Well, there's an interesting question there. I absolutely agree. The preferences don't get you all the way there. part of, we have a strange dual role of both acting on and delivering what the ministers decide and advising on what to do. So you're in a position of, the ministers probably be quite cross if we didn't feed back, actually, this is the way things are working in this area of extraordinarily complex pensions regulation or something there is no reason that they already had a strong worldview about. So even if you had a way of eliciting their worldview, how do you work out whether they would value a challenge to that worldview? And that's a difficult conversation to have, but it feels really important and it would benefit both sides enormously.
Yes. So as soon as we're hitting something that's difficult but powerful, we're probably getting close to what needs to be done. Yeah. That's usually a good sign. Yeah.
And this feels like we've hit on a mechanism that is powerful enough to have held these models in place, which I have been slightly perplexed by how tough they are, even in the face of overwhelming, as far as I'm concerned, overwhelming evidence that if we thought about it in a different way, that we get different outcomes. And even it's built into the sort of diversity narrative that we know we all come from the same background, we all think the same thing, we need people who think differently in order that we get better outcomes. But if actually you're not really anchored to the outcomes, you're anchored to a sense of I was going to use Greg's term justifiability, but it's that plus something else. It's about that sense. Are you actually doing your job of serving the government of the day if you don't correctly intuit their worldview and what's going to be acceptable to them? And my past as a policymaker was, because I'm me and I'm autistic and I do things my own way, was that I would offer them something different. But that I could feel the kind of tension that would be involved to the rest of the system in attempting to have that conversation. Yeah.
And so I think we're also getting to the edge of where my expertise could be made relevant to you, because now you are in things that are very specific to your situation. Sure. Yeah, right. Right.
I suppose one of the things that I would love to that somebody in my team came up with when we were talking about doing this podcast is, are we talking about something that's objective or subjective, or is this transjectivity?
This is transjectivity. Whenever problems are neither objective nor subjective, they are prototypical transjective entities. So the problem isn't in the world, right? But the world doesn't have problems. Organisms have problems with the world, right? And the problem isn't just in our subjectivity. Now there are some problems that are just internal to us. But when we're talking about what we prototypically mean by a problem, we mean something that has to do with whether or not we're properly fitted to the world, such that we're framing our problems, framing the world. Sorry, let me do it more carefully. They were properly fitted to the world, so we're framing the world in such a way that we can bring our relevant skills to bear to solve the problem, so we can achieve the goal that we want to achieve. So yes, I think problems are prototypical transjective entities. That's why relevance and anticipation, which are meta problems, relevance realization and anticipation are meta problems, problem solving, are also totally transjective entities. So you've got anticipation, affordance, relevance realization. Anything that's involving those, you call transjectivity.
Okay, that's really helpful clarification. And then another question that we came up with was, should we be looking to try and this may be that our previous conversations up till now makes this less relevant, but should we be looking to help people to not get sucked into mental models or worldviews, or is it that we need to design an upgraded one, get the ministers to test it with them and see if they would endorse it? I mean, I don't even know if this could be done, but at least if we could set it as a proposition, it might be able to. Because I think my team, their instinct is, well, don't replace the model, get people to step back from the model. I was like, I don't know that people can do that unless they've got a very unusual brain and a very unusual set of incentives, which is my team. And whether, in fact, what we need is to say, right, we've got these old Taylorist and ideas about internal organisation. We've got the economic ideas about the external world, and we need to provide some new frameworks, design a new mental model. I don't know how you do that, but that because what you need there is you need a new approach to thinking about systems inside and outside, which I'm not sure that there are any lead candidates for that. But I don't know if you can train people to not be sucked in by the models. I'm not even sure it'd be a good idea, because how then do you get coordination? And if you have people going off on one, then a bureaucracy responds understandably by saying, no, we need to coordinate. We've had this discussion with the ministers, and the ministers say that, well, therefore, if you don't do that, we need to stop it, which is an entirely understandable thing that an organization probably needs to do. So how do you maintain that the diversity of perspectives and the constant attachment of that to the context of the problems and people's got different bits of the elephant, whilst also doing that collectively? Like, this is the idea of how do you make an organization a proper distributed intelligence that is also capable of sensing and responding collectively, and not just executing a sort of preordained plan of what it means to manage.
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think you were saying this, but I think it's important to make it explicit. Having worldviews, having models, and having mental models, mutual models, that's not optional. Those are not optional. As you just start to take them away, you're just hitting combinatorial exposure. So that's not optional. One of the things that, and I'm wrestling with this problem too, with the Vervaeke Foundation and how we're trying to build, a wisdom cultivation platform and network communities into communities. We're doing all of this. And what we're trying to move towards is, can you get people to make one more higher order commitment, which is everybody acknowledge that the worldview needs to be an evolving worldview rather than a static worldview. And that in addition to using the worldview, they are committed not to abolishing it, but to working to constantly introduce some and re-evolve it, which means let's run some variations and let's kill most of them off by our selective criteria, allow some of them to survive, and build them into our model. And so in addition to using the model, we practice evolving the model and get everybody evolving the worldview, right? We get everybody committed to evolving it by periodically running variation and selection on it.
I love that. I think that's very similar to the conversation I had with my team member right before this, who's saying it probably needs to be understanding that it needs to grow and change. So I love that. I think that's bang on. And I wonder, I'm leaping here to some of the practices that we found useful in my team for, making progress, is constantly doing the perspectival bit. So
yes.
we have all of these tools for getting people to imagine the different ways of looking at things. And so on my whiteboard now, I have a list of all my favorite tools. So if somebody comes to me with a complex problem, my job is to figure out which combinations of tools are the most useful for this. So maybe doing the perspectival bit allows you to start to loosen up that participatory stuff. Yes, definitely. So I'm sort of developing an argument and I guess ultimately a hypothesis or even a theory that the nexus of transformation is the perspectival participatory interface. That's exactly where transformation occurs. Yes. Yeah, that feels absolutely right. And the propositional bit feels like it's needed in order to do that collectively.
Oh, yes. We have to deal with language because only language gives us the shareability. The problem people can make is they confuse the necessity of language for shareability with the necessity of language for the transformation, right? Right. It's like, and they confuse necessity and sufficiency, right? Well, it's necessary, so maybe that's all we need. It's like, no. It's necessary to make it shareable, but the shareable isn't the same thing as evolving the worldview. Right? Right. Things like that. Yes.
Yes. So I think it's really good that the Vervaeke Foundation is going to throw itself behind saying that this is a practical set of things that will enhance choice making and decision making. And
we very much are trying to, with virtue and virtuosity, try and build out connections to the organizational world, whether it's business or government or communitarian. We very much want to ramp up the More Wise project. All of the dimensions that make a culture run in a powerful way.
That's amazing. What an intent. This is a really, really helpful framing. I can see it joining up a bunch of things of the practices that the recommendations we make to people, which is like move from specialist language to common language, allows you to do that piece. But because it's not, you've got to have some domain specificity, but maybe you need to do that through participatory exercises.
Yes.
You can't, it's almost inevitable that with specialist language, you can't properly connect things together anyway. So you've got a problem if you've got to have specialization, but you've also got to have a common sort of narrative, or a way of translating that across complex, loads and loads of different domains. And maybe people having a different relationship with what language and propositions are and are for, rather than thinking it is the work. I wonder what ChatGPT will do to this, because that's going to change the way that we relate to the propositional manipulation.
So I have an online video essay about the LLMs, the large language models, and you can take a look at it. Where I talk about the scientific import, the philosophical import, and the spiritual import of these machines. And the capacity for enhancing propositional tyranny of these machines is significant. And then my publisher approached me and said he wanted to step it down, hopefully not dumb it down, to make it a much more generally accessible for the public at large. And so we have a book out. Well, the book is coming out in serial fashion. In part one, it was already released in August. Part two is going to be released in October, called Mentoring the Machines. And it's like $9.99 on Amazon if you want to start picking that up to get some take on how we should perhaps think about our relationship to these machines and what they can and cannot do, and what important thresholds we're facing where we can make decision points about how we want to go down this path.
I've watched the video essay, and some of my team have already pre-ordered the book, so we will definitely be taking those on board. But it feels like having some reflection on how outsourcing some of the propositional work to machines, does that create a jumping off point for us to think about the other elements of decision making that we can then actually focus on?
It could. And so there's a 3-part video series that Jordan Hall and I did recently on governance in this. And Jordan has the proposal that, not how they are now, but if we get sort of non-disputable, non-controversial AGI, we can unload a lot of the work that we're not actually particularly good at, our biological constraints, which would be, right, some of the stuff you're talking about. And then what we could do is it would free us up to invest a lot more in these non-propositional practices and transformations that we are actually surprisingly well evolved for, because they are much closer to our core adaptivity. And then we could bring in new styles of governance with that shift. And so I don't know if you've seen it, but you could take a look at those videos too, because we tried to develop that argument. Now, of course, that argument's developed at a very abstract level because we're trying to talk about all forms of governance. But that would be also where we explored that proposal you just made at length. And so I think it's a very good proposal. Like, it could go very bad. We could just, right? There's lots of ways in which this could go bad, but one way it could go well is it can free us up from being, what does Jordan say? Mediocre meat machines to being really, really powerful persons who exercise perspectival transformation and alter their identity with transformative experience and in a participatory fashion.
I've watched that maybe 4 or 5 times now, that series. It's spot on.
Oh, wow.
I found, especially the first one, and we could do a whole session on this, about moving from dealing with radical uncertainty. I've been doing some work with the folks over in Britain who have been thinking about radical uncertainty and how it's not compatible with the traditional approaches of economics, and it means we need to do things differently.
Yeah.
So there's loads of people coming at this from different places that I'm trying to connect. And the idea that you can't be an expert in a particular domain, because the idea of putting a boundary around it is part of the problem.
Yes.
And I think that what my team, by accident or design, I don't know, is doing is working out what it means to make good choices in policymakers. So up to a point, my guys are general purpose choice makers. But interesting, and I know we don't have time to talk about it, but we have found that it's helpful to have people work on the same area for a long time, because there's something about the domain specificity.
Yes.
That is pretty, so there's this kind of contradiction in my head between, we do need the domain specificity, but we don't need professional specialization in that way, or at least we need that to change, because it's not the application of another process. That is that way is the machine way of doing things, but at the same time, you still need to recognize that you can't have all the knowledge in one human head, and there's probably not even going to be captured all in the AGI. So you need to work out how you link humans together to keep a ability to zoom in and zoom out effectively while making those choices.
Excellent. So I just came back from Bergerac, where I was working with sort of practitioners, guides, and what we call the scholars. These are people who are both scholars in some ways, but they're also creating communities of practice around the collective intelligence of distributed cognition. And the proposal that was sort of that I made and we're sort of working on is doing something like what the brain does. What the brain breaks processing up into all these individual models that they run using mutual modeling with their specialization, and then into something like the default mode network, they come back together and they all make sure that they can talk in common and correct each other's models. And what you do is you have practices, right, where while you're doing is working on creating the we space between people, where you're not tackling any problem. You like, let's put the problem solving aside and let's make sure we got a really good we space between us, where you create that shared language, right, that shared agency, that shared perspective taking ability, and then people go off, right, and they do their particular specializations. And what you do is what the brain does. You do a point of processing between them, and you're constantly oscillating between specialized processing and coming together to make sure that your mutual models take the maintenance of mutual models is itself a problem that needs to be constantly solved repeatedly, so that you can then go out and do your specific problem solving, right? Okay, we're not solving any problems. We're making sure that we're all mutually, we correct each other's models of each other. And that's all we're doing here. We don't try and solve any problems. We just get that, and then we take that back to our special problem solving. And then we do that. And then we can do, once we're running that process, then we can meet in the in-between space where we're trying to do coordination about our problem solving.
I would love to hear more about that, because I'm struggling to imagine how you build that shared agency without a purpose, without a specific problem to anchor. I mean, that's everything that I do is always anchored around problem solving.
And this would be the hardest for you to bring in. But so if you take a look at some of the practices we do, like dialectic and dialogos, that are we just released one recently which was on Ken Lowry's channel, Climbing Mount Sophia, with myself, Ryan Barton, Ken Lowry, and Christopher Masterpietro. And you can see what that looks like. And you don't tackle a problem, you tackle a virtue, and that gets people to reconnect at this higher order level of what is our shared normativity and how am I in right relationship or not. And then that gets addressed, because if you don't share the normativity and people aren't in right relationship with it, then all of the other stuff you try to do is going to just screw up royally. And you get people to say, the problem we're solving is the problem of, do we have the shared normativity, and do we all feel that we are existentially committed to it and in right relationship with it? And that's what that's what you build in the we space. You don't So it's not like you're not doing nothing, but it's you're working at this level of virtue, of normativity. What do we think? That's even the wrong sentence. How do we realize compassion? How do we realize justice? How do we realize courage? And one of these things that helps people to do is to also get them to step back and reflect on what virtues do I think are relevant to any problem we're trying to solve. And I would put it to you, Carla, that if government is not doing this, government should shut down. Because if government is not asking the question, what are the virtues, what are the relevant virtues that should be brought to bear on this problem, and am I in deep right relationship with those virtues, then you should not be a government. You should not be in power.
Well, I think that there is something that we could attach to this, even in Britain, where we had to have a written constitution, which, by the way, I was really interested in. Jordan Hall was saying that gives you a special ability to respond to this change. You're like, okay, that's interesting, contextualizing the British government versus others. But we do have 4 values that have been, I think these have been in law for only about 15 years, but they've been in the Civil Service Code, I think since Victorian times, I think for over 100 years. And that is, I will forget all of them, but objectivity, honesty, integrity, and impartiality. So we are contractually obliged. Those sound like virtues. I think they are. I think some of the crunchy stuff around there is, what do we mean by objective?
Exactly. Well, no, I think I would put it to you that if you get people in the room doing dialectic and dialogos, you'll find there's crunchiness around each and every one of those. And part of what goes into people's modeling is they think they know what honesty is until they do these practices. And what inevitably happens out of all of this is people will say, I didn't realize what honesty is. Now I do. And they have a relationship of reverence again to the virtue, rather than having an automaticity about it.
I desperately want to know how to go about running those exercises. This feels like a concrete thing that you could do to start to refresh and dislodge some of these assumptions.
Well, I mean, we're going to do a workshop in October over a weekend, circling into circling into dialogos, in which you could take the workshop and you can take the whole program, and you could watch some of the videos and you could learn how to do it. That's how you do it.
Fantastic. That's going on my to-do list.
Okay. Yeah, you just you can reach out to the Vervaeke Foundation, reach out to Christopher Master Pietro. You can just Google "Circling into Dialogos Workshop Weekend." You'll get the next one coming out in October. And you know, if you want a couple of your team members, let us know. We can probably give you. I can guarantee giving you a discounted rate, doing the workshops, things like that.
Wonderful. I'm definitely going to act on that. This has given me so much useful steps forward instead of chasing around concepts in my head.
Well, thank you. I mean, like I said, I find you exemplary. And I think the fact that you're constantly willing to be in this, genuine back and forth discussion, and it gets into dialogos because we are merging things together, right, between us with the cognitive science. I think that's admirable. And I think it's really necessary and important.
Well, thank you. And it is definitely not just me. Loads of this stuff is coming from my team. So it is a collective enterprise, but it requires a certain level of resilience that I think we also need the practices for. To keep it. Yes. So,
Carla, I always like to give my guests the last word. It doesn't have to, it could be, but it doesn't have to be summative or cumulative or provocative or inspirational, but any last word you would like to leave our listeners with.
Oh, I should have remembered you were going to ask this because you asked this last time. What is the important thing? I guess it's thinking that both people who aren't in government but are familiar with these practices, as well as people who have come to this because they are interested in government, to appreciate the almost infinite complexity of the problems involved, and that's why this is so hard. It's not just because we're doing this wrong or that wrong or we're out of date, or it's because what we're trying to do is there's inherent trade-offs in it of managing something this level of dynamism, with this level of accountability to the wider populace, with this level of ambiguity and change at every step, I don't think the media always explain quite how complicated and complex this is to do. And I think if everybody could kind of pitch in the way that that you and your team have, then we'd have a better functioning world.
I agree, and thank you for saying that. I agree that often there is a rather simplistic narrative brought to bear in reporting on the behavior of the civil service. That's the case in Canada as well. It's probably a universal thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you very much, Carla. Great talking to you.
You too. Thank you so much.